Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for everyone who signed on. I really do appreciate it. I'm so glad you've been able to join us today for our talk on empowering anxious kids and moving towards meaningful engagement. My name is Dr. Ed Roldan. Again, I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join me today, and I do apologize for the hiccups here at the beginning. As I said in the chat earlier, I will be providing a link to the recording, and if Prime Care Family Health team wants to share that I'd be more than happy to pass that on to the team, and then it be passed on to anyone who's interested. So I want to start off with some acknowledgements. First off, I do want to thank the amazing staff from Prime Care Family Health team who have helped set this up. Gina, I'm looking at you. Thank you so much for setting this up. And I also want to thank Erin Matsuba, who's completing her residency at CAMH currently and also works at EPS. She's been kind enough to help moderate today. So I thank her. She will be moderating the chat. And maybe prompting me at certain times. A couple of things I just want to start off by reminding you. You'll notice when you signed in, camera and microphones will remain off. Feel free to put questions into the chat box, and I will try to answer any questions at the end. There will be times where I will be looking for feedback in that you could put into the chat. I'd be more than happy to hear some of the feedback as we get going. So thank you again. What are we going to be discussing today? We're going to start off by talking about anxiety. And one of the things I'm going to do is propose a slightly different way at looking at anxiety. We're then going to go very briefly into a form of treatment called acceptance commitment therapy called ACT. And we're going to spend some time on two components of ACT, values and committed action. And then we will transition into what the science says in terms of what are some evidence-based approaches in helping children navigate anxiety. And we're going to talk a little bit of how we can take some certain steps as parents and caregivers in supporting our children who are experiencing anxiety. And we'll go into a little bit of detail as to one component of the program called, we're going to be looking at accommodations, and then we're going to finish off by sharing some resources that are going to be quite helpful to caregivers and parents in the audience. So who am I? My name is Dr. Ed Roldan. I am the Director of Child and Adolescent Services at Etobicoke Psychological Services, and we also have a clinic in Vaughan that we call EPS Family Health. I am a clinical and school psychologist who works with children of all ages, young adults, and parents. I particularly enjoy working with parents. I also quite enjoy doing talks and doing supervision. I worked for 10 years in the school system. In the last 3 to 4 years, I've been working full-time in private practice. So thank you again for joining us. A couple of things I want to say right from the start. In our conversation today, I am not providing direct psychological services. What that means is we won't have time or the ability to discuss specific cases or situations. My aim is to provide some information and resources and maybe offer a slightly different way of approaching your relationship with your children. Although we call the talk Empowering Kids, you'll be surprised to hear that my focus is on the audience, parents and caregivers. And you'll see why. I'll explain why in the talk. And my goal is to begin to cultivate awareness and a sense of 1 degree change. So how can we, in our day-to-day lives, start doing small little things that will lead to meaningful changes down the road? And one thing I say as part of all my talks is there are going to be a variety of topics within the conversation today that could have their own presentation. So unfortunately, I cannot expand on every topic, but if you're interested in hearing about a topic in more detail, please feel free to reach out to myself or the Prime Care team, and we can figure out how to do that. So why are we talking about anxiety? Well, anywhere from 10 to 20% of school-age children have anxiety symptoms. Anxiety, when severe, can have a negative impact across multiple domains. If your child has anxiety, I don't need to tell you that, right? It could extend from family life, so whether it's emotional outbursts, whether it's poor nights of sleep, whether it's disruptions to work, parents having to leave work, parents having to lose jobs because of severe anxiety in their children. It can also impact attending school. It could impact work in school or participating in things at school. And it can also impact social and extracurricular activities, whether your child no longer wants to go to parties, has quit competitive swim or dance or art. It can have a huge impact across a variety of domains in a child and family's life. It can also go unnoticed, particularly for those kids who internalize it, right? And if they sort of keep it inside, you might not see some of the anxiety and understand its true impact. And the reverse is true too. For the kids who are externalizers, we often go to target, oh, why are they showing aggression? Why are they showing defiance? And we start to go down that route without noticing that it might be anxiety that's actually triggering some of those responses in the children. And lastly, anxiety has a high rate of comorbidity, whether it is children with anxiety have low self-esteem, whether they're irritable, whether they have trouble sleeping, concentrating, whether mood and motivation is depleted. There are a lot of things that can happen when you're in a sustained state of anxiety. A sustained state of stress can lead to a lot of things breaking down. One thing I want to make a distinction, and you'll see in the next slide, but one thing I want to make sure I emphasize is that when we talk about anxiety, we're talking about persistent and excessive worry or apprehension. We're talking about something that is chronic and ongoing, and most importantly, and this will become quite relevant when we start talking about ACT, is that it interferes with daily functioning and well-being. And I want to make this distinction and separate it from typical fears. It's also important for us to recognize that there are fears and anxieties that are a normal part of development. For example, in the first years of life, it's quite normal to be afraid of loud noises, strangers, new places, heights. For kids, as they get a little bit older, preschool into early school years, they have fears of being alone, fears of the dark, fears of specific animals, imaginary creatures like monsters under the bed. And as you get into school age, everything from death. So, for example, a child might have experienced the death of a grandparent, and all of a sudden they're thinking about death. They're starting to fear negative evaluation by others. This is particularly important as kids get into the older grades and into high school. They start to worry about illness, bodily injury, natural disasters, everything from floods, tornadoes, um, storms. You'll start to see those. Some of those are typical. Now, some of those can be clinically significant, but normally what we're looking for are anxieties that fall outside of these typical fears. And we're going to go into that in a bit more detail. So here's a question for you. What if anxiety keeps us trapped? What if anxiety keeps us in, I chose this badly resolution picture because it showed a child in a box. And so often when I'm working with a child in the clinic, it literally is like a child who's in a bubble. And I often use the analogy of a hula hoop. When I'm working with a child who's really anxious, it's almost as if they're walking with a hula hoop and only the things that they find safe can go in the hula hoop. One of the problems is it's really hard to get in certain rooms with a hula hoop, right? You can't get into certain parties, you can't get into certain scenarios because the hula hoop gets in the way. And so that's one of the questions I want you to ask. What happens if anxiety starts to form a cage, so to speak, around our child? Well, if you've seen me do my talk before, you'll see that this is something that I tend to use most of my talks. I'm going to suggest that maybe we can look at anxiety in a slightly different way. Okay, and I provide a trigger warning because on the next slide is going to be a big hairy tarantula. So if you do not like tarantulas, look away, close your eyes. But let's pretend that all of us are in one big room and someone drops in giant tarantulas into the room. I'm going to ask you in the chat if you could respond and share with me, what do you think, how would you react to tarantulas being in the room with you? Now, some caveats. You cannot kill the tarantula and you cannot get rid of the tarantula, which most kids will tell me that's what they would do. Kill it and get rid of it. Let's say you can't do that. How would you respond to being in the same room as a tarantula? If you could put in the chat, if you're kind enough to put in the chat. Aaron, I can actually see the screen. I just have to look down. So run away, freak out, scared, move to the other side, climb the furniture. Exactly. So two things are going to happen when the tarantula is in the room with us. First, our attention is going to be on the tarantula. We're going to track wherever the tarantula goes. Secondly, our behavioral choices are going to shrink. We're no longer going to remember why we were in the room. We're only going to be tracking the tarantula, moving away from the tarantula. So if it goes to one corner, I'm going to go to the opposite corner. And I'm only looking for how do I stay away from the tarantula and how do I escape? I'm going to forget why I was in the room. In that example, tarantula is like anxiety. It takes all of our attention. We're constantly looking and scanning for it, and it starts to control our choices and our behavioral options. Here's the hard part. There's good news and bad news about this analogy. The bad news is I don't know how to get rid of people's tarantulas. And the reason is this, it's quite simple. If you think of things that are important to you, for example, I'm a father of two boys. My boys are the most important thing in my world. At any given point, I could be, talking to Aaron in supervision. I could be, doing therapy with somebody, and my brain will do its job and it'll say things like, "Are you sure your boys are safe?" Now, in that moment, as soon as I start to think about the safety of my children, there is a tarantula in the room, and I can choose to start to track it. I could call the school. I could go drive to the school. I can call my wife. I could do all these things, and I can start to choose to dance with the anxiety. Or, and this is the good news, and when we use this analogy at the clinic, we often talk about what I want to teach individuals is that let's say we're all in the same room and tarantulas are dropped into the room. What I want to teach individuals is to notice the tarantula. So we're not going to ignore it. We're going to, oh, there's a tarantula. We're going to notice how uncomfortable it makes us feel. And then we're going to make a conscious decision to move and act in the way we want to be moving and acting in that room, in spite of the tarantula being present. So again, if I notice that my brain is telling me my boys are unsafe, I'm going to notice it. I'm going to say, yep, I know it's uncomfortable. What do I want to be doing in this room? I want to be continuing supervision. I want to continue to do therapy. And I'm going to continue to do actions that are meaningful to me in the same room as the tarantulas. So seed number one, I said I wanted to cultivate awareness. So seed number one of my first proposals to you as parents is, can we have less of an emphasis on solving or getting rid of anxiety in our children's lives? And can we notice and can we start to pay attention to small behavioral changes towards engagement and meaning? So noticing the tarantulas and then moving towards something that's important to you. This is going to become really important when we talk about ACT. Notice that I discuss moving towards meaningful engagement rather than moving away from something, which is what we typically do. Something comes up that's distressing, we move away. Rather than doing that automatically, we want to start to notice those things and then make decisions that are meaningful for us. So this leads to a transition to talking about acceptance and commitment therapy. ACT for short. ACT is actually a pretty complex model, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But the reason I'd like to talk about it here is a couple of things. So what is a brief, just looking at a brief overview of ACT, it is an approach that helps us to accept what is out of our control and commit to action that improves or enriches our lives. So in that example of the tarantula, we accepted that the tarantula was in the room with us. We accepted that we couldn't kill it and we couldn't get rid of it. We stopped fighting with the fact that the tarantula was in the room with us. And the goal of ACT is to foster something called psychological flexibility, which is basically the opposite of rigidity and avoidance. It's moving towards being flexible with what comes your way by combining things like mindfulness, being present. Here I am in the room with a tarantula, and I'm really uncomfortable, and yet this is what I want to be doing in the room with the tarantula. And also practicing self-acceptance. This is crucial when I'm talking to parents. I didn't say this before, but when I talk with parents, one of the very first things I tell parents is when we're talking, this is a place of like no judgment. Okay. I am a child psychologist who fails daily as a parent. Daily, I am having moments of failure as a parent. And so I know what it's like to be in a scenario and allow for my discomfort, for my anxieties, for my worries to lead to my choices rather than allowing for me to be conscious and mindful and say, well, what do I want to do in this moment? Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. One last thing about ACT is that one of the main things we're trying to work against or trying to notice is something called experiential avoidance. In brief, experiential avoidance is basically this. If you really were to notice what drives our choices and decisions, so many of them are based on avoiding anything that is uncomfortable. So I don't want to feel this anxiety. I won't go into the scenario. I don't want my child to, whatever it is, I don't want to feel angry. I don't want to feel uncomfortable. I don't want to feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And so therefore I start to avoid scenarios that could potentially give rise to those uncomfortable feelings or experiences. So I said to you earlier that the ACT model is quite complex, and there's 6 components to it. I mentioned that we already touched upon one, which is the acceptance part. We accepted that the tarantulas were in the room with us. Today, I'm going to focus on 2 of them. One of them is values, and we'll talk about what that is. And second is committed action. Okay. And one of the ways that I've seen ACT sort of discussed is if you look at the 6 components, 3 ways to think about it is letting go of the things that we cannot control. So tarantulas are in the room; they're going to arise for us and for our kids in everyday life. Showing up when something is hard and difficult, being there for your children, and then get moving, finding small actions towards meaningful engagement. And again, I'm going to go into detail with some of these examples. Again, a brief overview. So what are we talking about with ACT? We're trying to increase our willingness to face our thoughts, feelings, and the challenges that life brings with the understanding that it is done in the service of things we value. And you'll see in the next slide when we talk about this as parents. The final step is accomplished through committed action by knowing where we want to move as a parent and then choosing small baby steps towards those things that we want to accomplish. So let's look at this. Let's do a thought experiment. Uh, I hope that you guys are willing to do this one with me, this exercise with me. And what I'm going to ask you to do is if you're comfortable, is to close your eyes. If you're not comfortable, you could just look down or what have you. What I want you to do for parents and caregivers out there is I want you to think back to a moment, a special moment with your child. Perhaps for someone like me, I go back to the first time I held my firstborn. And I want you to find a moment like that in your memory. Maybe it's, the first time you held your child. Maybe it's the sun is hitting your child in a particular way and you sort of, pick up on something that's slightly different in that moment. Notice that I don't say it has to be a happy moment. Okay. It could have been your first time holding your child after a very stressful delivery process and labor. Okay. But in that moment, I want you to imagine you looking at your child almost like for the first time. And I want you to notice details from that memory, like perhaps their hair, maybe their little nails, maybe their smell. For me, I think back to the weight of my son. I think back to looking around the room and noticing just how much commotion was happening. I think back to just holding him for the first time. And in that moment, when you think about that moment, what I want you to think about is, did you promise them anything? Did you say anything to them? Did you say, this is what I'm hoping to do, or this is what I'm going to try to do for you? Or did you talk to them? Did you make promises to them? Think about that. And if you can bring that to mind, in essence, what you're doing is you're touching upon values as a parent. Another way to think about this, I often get families to do this or parents to do this, particularly when they're having a really hard time connecting with their child. I might say something like, I don't know how old your children are. They might be really young. They might be teen. They might be young adults. But imagine that they're younger, and let's say it's the night before their high school graduation, and you happen to walk by their door, and you overhear them talking about you. What do you wish to hear? Particularly, what do you wish to hear that would make you feel warm, or that would make you feel like, you know what, my parenting has made a difference? What would you want them to say about you? That you're present, that you're a good teacher, that you've taught them right and wrong. This is what we mean in ACT, or we talk about values, are things that matter most to us. They are qualities and characteristics that we aspire to. So one thing I want to clarify, this is the difference between a goal and a value. A goal is something obtainable, right? So for example, I could set the goal that I want to prepare lunches for my children every night. So that's a goal, that's achievable, I can check it off. However, if my value is to be a dad who's present, I won't reach enough present moments to all of a sudden, somebody comes out with a certificate and says, hey, you're a present dad. It's never achievable. It's something that I can choose to move towards in any given moment. Today, as I am feeling stressed out and trying to figure out this presentation, I could go home and figure out, how am I going to be a present dad today in this given moment? And so when we talk about values, we often, try to get people to think about these things as direction points and not destinations. So I can move west to California, or I can constantly move west, right? And this is really important. You'll see in a couple of slides, because in the most difficult moments as parents, when you are struggling to find answers, the values are what I would hope you can use to guide you. And we'll talk about that again in a couple of slides. The other part of ACT that I wanted to talk about is committed action. And committed action, really, from the standpoint of parenting, is about trying new things and, most importantly, persisting in what you're doing in the service of your values. So in other words, committed action is putting our values into practice. So I'm going to give you two examples of this. So I have a 10-year-old son. He plays competitive soccer. He gets extremely anxious about soccer. He loves it, but every game we're having a battle about, I want to quit, I don't want to play. He never plays as well as he practices. He gets very negative and he wants to shut down. He doesn't want to go. He feels sick. And it's so fascinating. I said to you earlier, I confess to failing as a parent. I got to tell you that particular moment is when I can be, as parents, we struggle sometimes to be validating, which is something we're going to talk about in a bit, because sometimes we say it's just a soccer game. It's just like a regular soccer game, right? That's the easy thing we want to say. In those moments, so let me give you an example of how we can take small committed action. Let's say I notice that I keep invalidating my son, and I keep saying things to him like, hey, bud, it's just a soccer game. Who cares? Right? Let's say I say that to him. And I notice that. And I say to myself, you know what? Is that consistent with the value of a parent who wants to be present and available? No, I don't think so. What can I do to start maybe tweaking things? I can choose, for example, during the week, I can start to model and share when I'm anxious, right? I might say to my son, hey, Marcus, I have a talk today, and I don't know how it's going to go well. I don't know if it's going to go well, and I'm feeling really uncomfortable, and my heart's racing, and I have butterflies in my tummy. And I might say to him, what do you think? What do you think I should do? And he might tell me the things that we tell him to do, right? Or I could do something like, as a family, we can sit down and decide that as a family, we're going to start doing just regular mindful breathing that we're going to doing every day as part of our dinner routine or as part of our bedtime routine. I can take small little actions that are consistent with the father I want to be, that is going to help my child navigate those anxiety-provoking moments without avoiding them. I'm going to give you one other example. It's not really related to anxiety, but I want to show you again how 1 degree change, one small thing, can lead to meaningful changes in your relationship with your children. Let's use my son again as an example. let's say I've noticed that we're getting into all these arguments on Saturdays and I feel disconnected. I feel like we're not vibing, he and I could choose that on Monday when I get home from work. My son loves soccer, so he's often looking up like soccer stats and soccer clips of like who scored, and he calls the Premier League, and he can tell me about all these things. And sometimes I'm not listening, and I'm like, okay, buddy, I'm not really into soccer so much. But let's say that I'm feeling disconnected. I can choose again a value-based action. I can say, you know what, starting on Monday of next week, when I get home from work, no matter how tired I am, no matter how exhausted I am, I'm going to walk in and say, hey, bud, Marcus, let's say he's watching videos. Hey, tell me what happened in the Prem today. Who scored? Who won? And maybe I spend 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes listening to him talk to me about the Premier League. Now, if I do it once, that's a nice moment. But imagine I do that on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. I do it for a week. I come back and I do it for a second week, a third week, and a fourth week. What I have done is I've taken a 3 minute, 5 minute decision that I have made, a committed action that I have now repeated, and through repetition, I've created meaning and engagement. And years down the road, when someone asks him about his dad, he might say, "Oh, he used to talk to me about the Prem all the time." Now, something I want to point out: this doesn't mean I'm going to love the Prem. I'm not doing it because I want to know about the Premier League. I'm doing it because it's in the service of what I want to develop in terms of our relationship. The value is the relationship with my son. And so I'm engaging in something purposefully to be able to make that connection. We'll see it number two. In difficult moments, when we're feeling overwhelmed, lost, feeling like nothing is working, I want you to think about what it is, the type of parent you want to be. So in 2 slides ago, you probably saw that there was a lighthouse. Sometimes we will talk about in ACT, we'll talk about values as a lighthouse. Imagine you're in the sea, in the dark sea, and you're lost. The lighthouse is there to guide you, to tell you where the coast is. Or another analogy we often use is a compass point. Imagine you're in a jungle, lost, dark, don't know where to go. The compass point is what's going to guide you towards where you want to be. So that is what I want you to think about as values. In those moments when you're feeling lost, ask yourself, when I was talking to that baby, when I overhear him or her talking about me, what do I want them to say? And then what is one small, deliberate, and meaningful step that I can do today to move me in that direction? Which leads me to, I think in the blurb, I wrote up the blurb, and then I was like doing the presentation. I was like, I better make sure I hit on everything in the blurb. And one of the things I talked about is concrete steps. So let's talk about concrete steps, because I've given you all the sort of theory, and let's talk about some concrete steps. And in order to get to the concrete steps, we're going to base it on scientific findings. And the reason I put this space guy in this slide is because we're going to talk about a program called SPACE, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. This is a program developed by Dr. Ellie Leibowitz out of Yale University. And in the last 10 to 15 years, they have started to develop literature findings that show that you can treat clinically significant childhood anxiety and OCD without ever working with the child. You work directly with the parents. So the reason I was spending all that time talking to you in a talk about empowering children is because one of the best ways to empower children is to empower parents with the awareness that they can make meaningful changes by shifting in how we respond to anxiety. One of the interesting things, so I've been trained in space, and when you go to the training, Dr. Leibowitz talks about why he developed this program. And one of the things he says is that when you look at how anxiety is treated in children, historically, it's been treated in the same way as adults. And yet, one of the things that he points out is that our response to a stressful scenario or anxiety-provoking scenario is vastly different. As an adult, we get startled and we get anxious and we respond in a certain way. If a child is startled, if a child is scared, imagine they're walking in the hallway and someone pops out, just scares them. Maybe in the chat, what do they do? What does a child do when they're startled? Anyone willing to take a risk? Run to mom. Run to parent and caregiver. That is the part that has been missing in the treatment modalities. A child looks for a caregiver, a safe haven. And more importantly, or not more importantly, but also importantly, as as caregivers, we are hardwired to respond to that emotional response from our children. So when we see our child in distress, we're going to want to pull them out. This is really important when we think about empowering children who are anxious. So again, you can do a whole talk in space. I'm going to do this very quickly. One of the things I'm going to say to you is at the end, you're going to find some great resources at the end, and I'm going to share the resources with the team, and you can I can email them out as well. One of the resources that I provide is a book by Dr. Eli Leibowitz that he just released in about last 2 years, and it walks you through the space program in a very real way. Okay, and so I do encourage it's available through the public library system, so you don't have to purchase it. I would encourage people to read that book. And one of the things that space does, it does three things. The first step in space is trying to teach parents how to accept and validate the child's distress. Okay, so when I see my son getting anxious, rather than saying, buddy, it's just a soccer game, how do I find a way to accept and validate that experience? In the first point, I say that there are various programs that do this very well. At the end of the talk, in two of the resources, excuse me, I include links to two programs that will walk you through how to validate your children's responses. And we often talk about this as emotion coaching. It will also be part of our talk next week. I will talk a little bit about more detail in that about emotion coaching next week. The thing I want to point out is one of the links I provided you, the Mental Health Foundations, actually has free modules. You can go and watch modules on how to do this. And one of the things that I want to emphasize about acceptance and validation is that in essence, what we're learning to do is saying yes to the emotion that our child is expressing while still setting limits. So we're not necessarily saying yes to the behavior, and we don't actually have to actually agree with the emotion. So for example, if you have a child who doesn't want to go to school and they're having a meltdown in the morning and they're saying, oh, I don't want to go, I have a presentation today, last presentation went horribly wrong. In acceptance and validation, you'll be doing something like, hey bud, I can see, yeah, it's hard, huh? You're really anxious about going to school, huh? You have that presentation and your mind is telling you you're going to fail and you're going to be embarrassed and everyone's going to laugh at you. Why, it sounds so difficult. And you know what? You have to go to school. And so we're spending time validating and accepting that emotional experience while also continuing to set expectations for our children. In the programs that I'm talking about, one is called emotion focused family therapy. The other one's called emotion focused skills therapy. They started together, then they split up. But if you look up their sort of system, they provide you almost like a script of how to validate. And in their validation script, they basically are telling you to use three becauses. So I can understand you're angry because your sister threw that, and because this, and because this. And at the same time, you know you're not allowed to do this. And so you often will reflect to them three becauses, and you'll avoid the word but. So instead of saying something like, I know you are angry because your sister took your toy away from you, but in the models, you're taught that the but invalidates the first part of the sentence. So a simple switch is to use the word and. You'll notice I've been doing that constantly. Instead of using the word but, you've heard me use the word and all over the place. So I get it. I get it. It's hard. You don't want to, it's hard for you to sleep by yourself, huh? You're scared and you don't know what's in the dark and you want mommy and daddy to be here with you. And I know it's scary. And, mommy and daddy need sleep. And I know you're quite capable of doing it. So the next step is instilling a sense of resilience in our children. How do we communicate to them that we are confident that they can handle what it is that they are facing? I see this is hard for you. Here's the but. Here's the word that could be a but. And I'm sure you can handle it. And so those first two steps of space, you could do a whole program on because those can be extremely challenging, particularly if you're having extreme emotional outbursts, right? And so again, validation, acceptance of the emotion that your child is experiencing. Sometimes, remember what we said at the beginning, a child could be anxious, but they're displaying anger, frustration, defiance, right? It is accepting any emotion. I can understand why you said no to daddy. And you know that you you still have to, proceed with the demand or the request. Oh, I know at the time we started late. So Aaron, I don't know, we're talking about giving me a cue at 7:45, but I think we started late, so we might go a little bit later. So yeah, the first steps are acceptance, validation, and then confidence. Couple tips about validation. When you see your child express an emotion that is difficult for you to observe, remember that sense of like wanting to save your child. In this validation component, what I want you to think about is how do you attend to the emotion? So how do you tune in to the emotion versus tune out? So often, if we remember experiential avoidance, when we see something we don't want to experience, we just sort of like, I can't deal with my son when he's anxious. Louise, go handle him. Go talk to him. Oh no, I can't deal with defiance. I'm gonna tune out and push away. In the first step of validation, it is about attending to the emotion that your child is expressing. And we do that by noticing and paying attention. And the next step is really crucial, is labeling the emotion. This is particularly important the younger your child is because they don't have the emotional vocabulary. And often when I'm working with parents, I talk to them about that at the initial stages, you are the narrator for your child. I can understand you're angry. And I can tell because I heard your voice change and I can see your face is getting red and your fists are balled up and I can sense the tension. You're angry, huh? And so in that way, if you've ever seen Dan Siegel talk, he talks about name it to tame it, right? So how do we start to label that emotion for our children? And then the third step is that validation piece. No wonder you feel that way. I can understand why that is so hard for you. Of course, you feel that school is too scary and that people are going to laugh at you. And because last time you did a presentation, people did laugh. And so that's how, the validation. So attending to the emotion, labeling the emotion, and validating the emotion. And then lastly, the other thing I want to talk about is when you see an emotional response in your children, sometimes we can get caught up in responding to the content of what our child says. So I'll give you an example. So let's say I stuck to my guns and I insisted that my son goes to school on a day he doesn't want to go to school. He might, as he leaves the house, he might turn and say, "You're the worst father. I hate you." How often in those moments that hurts, right? Like as a parent, especially if you're thinking like, I didn't sleep last night, I did this for you, I did this. It can be very hurtful when a child does that. And so in many ways, one of the things I want to pay attention is notice that response that you have. Notice that you want to deal with that discomfort. Like he knows better. I need to show him that he's not allowed to talk to me that way. And notice how oftentimes when we respond to make that feeling go away, we're moving in a direction opposite of our values as a parent. And so no longer being a supportive parent who is going to try to understand what my child is really saying, which is he feels powerless because I made a decision for him and we can talk about it later. And when he gets back from school, we will sit down and talk about it and try to find a different way for him to communicate that in a way that is validated and developmentally appropriate. So seed number 3, and this is a crucial one. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because I often say this also to people I supervise. If you ever find yourself in a scenario as a parent or as a caregiver and you're in your head, you're thinking, I have no idea what to do here, that's okay. You don't have to have an answer. In those moments, I just want you to listen, empathize, and maybe thank them for sharing or thank them for being the one that they told, right? And the reason is so often we look to provide a solution. We look to provide an answer. And when we do provide an answer, really, oftentimes without recognizing, we're invalidating the child's experience. And especially as they get older, any answer you offer, they already know. Let's be honest. Like, I know that, mom. I know that, dad. And so in that, if you find yourself like overwhelmed, like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, We're going to notice, just like we noticed the tarantulas. We're going to notice and we're going to remind ourselves as a parent, I'm working to build resilience in my child. And so a value-based decision right now is to stay silent, listen, empathize, and thank them. And I guarantee you, you're going to make mistakes. And in those moments when you make mistakes, be kind to yourself. Notice that self-critic, the inner critic. Notice the part that says, I screwed that up. Oh my God, what did I do? Oh my God, how did that happen? Notice that part. We're going to notice it. We're going to thank it for raising its point of view and say, and I tried my best, and tomorrow's a new day, so I can continue to try my best. Um, I'm going to try and go quickly because I know we're supposed to go till 8. I don't know how long people can stay, so I'm going to try and go quickly. The last part of space is when you start to target something they call accommodations. And an accommodation is anything extra that you do to help your child avoid discomfort or uncertainty. And in some ways, by accommodating, what we're doing is we're inadvertently hindering our children's learning that they can handle what is coming their way, including the worst case scenario. So we are interfering and saving them before they can actually learn that the scenario either wasn't that bad, or even if it was horrible, they got through it. And so that is key for empowering our children in the face of anxiety. So let's look at accommodations. Some examples of accommodations are you participating in anxious behaviors? For example, are you answering a question over and over and over again? Yes, son, I'll be home today by 7. Yes, son, getting a text. Yes, I'll be home by 7. Yes, son, I'm going to be home. I'm going to make sure I'm home, okay? Are you taking your child to the doctor repeatedly? Dad, this is the one. This pain is the one. I know that this is the one. Okay, son, let's go to the doctor. Let's go get checkup, blood work, and again, or picking them up from school, getting the call, like, no, he can't handle it. He has to go home and go in to pick him up. Another one, sorry, I know you have to run. I apologize. Another one would be avoiding anxiety-producing situations. So, are you sleeping in the same room as the child? Are you allowing them to stay home from a trip? So, those are some examples of accommodations. Another type of accommodation is when you start to modify presentation, modify things that the family is engaging in. An example of that would be, are you taking on responsibility so your child is not triggered? Like, for example, are you all of a sudden the soccer coach because that's the only way your child's going to play soccer? Are you rearranging your schedule so that, I cannot, take that promotion because it makes me work on weekends and know that day I have to be home? Are you having overly rigid schedules where everything is controlled to a T because unknown and uncertainty causes huge outbursts from your child? Are you triggering objects? Are you hiding triggering objects or avoiding certain words? I've worked with families where you're not allowed to use the word vomit. You're not allowed to walk in a specific part of the house because that's where she vomited last time. Or you're not allowed to take a certain route past that restaurant where whatever happened. So notice that sometimes we can modify our behavior as a family, and that is a form of accommodation. We're almost done. So one of the questions people are naturally going to come up with is it an accommodation? Let me provide you some guidelines as to whether things are accommodations or not. First, is it developmentally appropriate? So if your 3-year-old or 4-year-old wants you to be in the room, sometimes when they fall asleep, that's perfectly fine. Now, if your child is 14 and 15, and now they're asking you to sleep in the same room as them, developmentally appropriate, it's no longer developmentally appropriate. So you want to notice that. I would ask you to reflect as a parent. What is your motivation for doing the behavior? Is it because you can't stand seeing your child in distress? I want you to notice that. Notice what it is that's causing you to jump into the scenario. Would you be doing that behavior if your child was not anxious? Are you doing the same with your other children? What happens if you don't do the behavior? So let's say you don't engage in that accommodation. Are you seeing outbursts? Are you seeing a child who has a huge emotional sort of reactions? Those are things that I want you to consider if you're having clinically significant anxiety and you want to start to notice whether you're engaging in, and I should point out, we all accommodate. Sorry, I should point out, we all accommodate. So accommodations by themselves are not a bad thing. It is noticing when we're over accommodating and getting to a place where we're changing our behavior. So seed number 4, and this is more for the families who have clinically significant anxieties. When you follow the SPACE program, one of the first steps is to start to chart and document all the accommodations we engage in. So for example, are you making sure that you have their favorite cereal in the morning? Are you making sure that their lunch is labeled a certain way? Are you paying attention to those things? So tracking is the first step. And then in SPACE, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to choose one accommodation to systematically remove. And when you do that, you communicate it to the child. So I might say to Marcus, I've been noticing that, at soccer or whatever, we notice that that's not helping. So from now on, we're going to start doing this. And so the idea is you communicate with the child what it is that which accommodation you're going to remove, and you give them an explanation as to why you think it's helpful to remove it. One of the questions that comes up is, how do you choose what accommodation to target? Well, you want to make sure it's a significant problem. And 2, it has to be recurring and frequent. It can't be something that only happens once a month. You're not going to see an impact. And lastly, you have to make sure it's anxiety related in that you are doing some sort of accommodation to reduce the anxiety your child is experiencing. And lastly, if you do look at this resource and start to try to do some of these things and you find yourself having difficulty gaining traction, that's where you might want to sort of seek professional help. And there are some GTA clinics now that are doing SPACE programming. There's one that's running groups, and there's a few more clinics in the area that are now trained. And so there are some options for families out there. Okay, guys, I'm gonna just wrap up this last thing, an overview. What have I said to you in one slide? I started off by asking you to think about anxiety in a slightly different way. So rather than something to solve, what is it that it's telling us? Again, that idea of if you care about something, you're likely going to be anxious about it. And more importantly, as a parent, how do we look at how we can guide our child through the anxiety rather than avoid it? In those difficult moments, as parents, I recommend that you try to focus on what it is as a parent you want to accomplish. What are the values? What type of parent do you want to be? And how do you take small steps towards what matters to you as a parent? When your child is experiencing big reactions, validate your child's and your experience. And if you're getting to clinically significant anxiety, you want to do things like notice and track accommodations before systematically targeting them. Okay, that's basically the end of my talk. So let me just walk you through some of my resources. This book right here is The Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, is the one by Ellie Leibovitz. I'm a big Dan Siegel fan, so The Whole Brain Child is a great book. I'm also a big Lisa Coyne fan, so she has a book, The Joy of Parenting. All of these books are available through the public library system, all highly recommended. These 3 books are very ACT-based. These first 2 are more for teens. So if you have a child who experiences sort of general anxiety, Stuff That Sucks is a great book. If you have a teen who has OCD, Stuff That's Loud is a great book. And then Lisa Cohen has just released a new Tired of Anxiety for Children. And it uses ACT as a way to target anxiety in children. And they are just about to release a teens version, which I'm very excited for that to come out. And then in terms of the website, we're going to, thanks, Gina, Emotion Focused Skills Training, Mental Health Foundations. This is the one that has the free resources and free modules. Anxiety Canada is also a great resource. And then DNAV is a model that incorporates ACT for children and adolescents. And they also have a lot of free resources on their website. So you could go there and you can have worksheets, great ways of explaining how we can target anxiety, and a couple other. And I didn't include one. I'll probably add one to. Oh no, sorry, I apologize. I keep going back. Then the Alan Kasdan is a big name in parenting. He has a free. I didn't realize this until recently. There's a free program you can do, free of charge. You can go to his website and you can do module-based a free parenting program. I think it's great. Go ahead if you think it's going to be helpful. You can do that. And then lastly, just some of our contact information. This is our Vaughan clinic. I didn't add my Etobicoke. I don't know why, I forgot. Here's my email. Here's our clinic email on our website. I guess if there's, in the last slide is like questions and concerns. If we have time, if anyone has questions or, thank you, Kimberly. I hope some of those resources are going to be very helpful to you. I'm wondering if there are any questions or comments. And I'm sorry, if you see me looking down, it's because I'm using a device with two screens and my chat is on the bottom screen. I guess no chats, no questions. Too much for a chat. Feel free to reach out. You can send an email. I will be. So I'm going to be doing, so just to reiterate, so I'm going to be doing 3 more talks. Next week, we will be targeting sort of mindful parenting with some emotion coaching will be in there. In 2 weeks, we'll be doing how do we support children with ADHD. And then in 2 weeks after that, we're going to be talking about how to support families in transition. So families going through separation and divorce, and some of the things to consider as parents. Um, so I'm really excited for that opportunity, and I'm so sorry about today's glitch at the beginning. I hope you found some information helpful, and I hope you will join for next week's talk. And thank you to Aaron and Gina and the whole team at Prime Care. Um, Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Kelly. All right, guys. Thank you. I guess I'll stop now and we'll share the link to the talk afterwards. Just seeing someone else is typing, so no problem, guys. Have yourself a great evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Take care, everyone.